I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Culture, Media and Creative Industries, or CMCI, as we like to call it, at King's College London, where I teach on 2 master's programs on kind of cultural and creative industries and arts and cultural management. So this is where I'm coming from. So I'll say a little bit about education later on. And my research has been about the experiences of cultural workers. That is kind of speaking to cultural workers in different fields. For me, especially, it has been in film and television production, although not only that, about their kind of daily working lives, their experiences of producing culture and what that means. And more in this research, I have become very interested in the inequalities within these cultural industries. And that means inequalities, I think, both in the workforce of the industries and potentially also how those inequalities in the workforce might translate into culture itself, right? So that's what I want to say a little bit more about in these comments. So I'll sort of try and read, but hopefully not. We'll see how we go. I wanted to get it all down. Okay, so, and by the way, I'm gonna talk a little bit about data, but I'm gonna try not to give you too many kind of statistics. I want to try and keep it discursive. I can reel some off if you'd like me to, but I'll try and just give you the broad contours of what we know, right, about these industries. So, we all know, I think, that there is a fundamental contradiction in cultural and creative industries, those industries that we all work in or are interested in or want to work in some way. So the contradiction is this. On the one hand, creativity and culture are widely viewed, and I think Liliana said this perfectly, really that culture is and should be or is viewed as fundamentally egalitarian, right? It can or it should be open to all. We should all be able to access our own creativity and as a form of kind of, human expression. So, on the one hand, creativity, it is supposedly, or, we view it as egalitarian, open to all, a source of artistic expression, a source of emancipation, a source of freedom itself, right? And of, a kind of a deep sense of empathy, that culture can provide empathy and that is crucial for us all as human beings, right? So, we know all of this on the one hand. And yet, we also know that when we look at who produces culture and media, that is, who has access to work in these industries, who can sustain careers in these industries, and I mean, sustain on the longer term, right? And what or who we see in culture and media, whether it's television, film, advertising, fine art, whatever it might be, we know that these industries are far from equal. They are in fact hugely unequal and exclusive. They are unequal in terms of gender, ethnicity, class and socioeconomic background, age, disability, sexuality. We could keep talking about, the list kind of goes on. We also know that these inequalities replicate, that is, of course there are differences, but those inequalities are actually surprisingly consistent across places, across nations, across regions, across industries. Of course there are differences within particular industries. For example, some of my work on screenwriting has found that more women might write for television than for feature film, and there might be reasons why we could discuss those differences. So it's not kind of routine across the board. And I suppose the other thing that is interesting and or tricky for those of us interested in researching these inequalities is that they are multifaceted and they are very, very complex, actually. They are complex, but yet they're also really evident across various kind of indices. Whichever questions we ask, if we look at relative numbers in employment, if we look at pay, if we look at contractual status, if we look at seniority, we see the inequalities there for us. So to focus just on gender equality, since we're here to discuss this particularly today, some recent research by some colleagues of mine in the UK looked at and demonstrated that gender segregation works both horizontally and vertically in cultural industries. So on the vertical axis, most of those in positions of power, that is funders, gatekeepers, chief executives, senior managers in cultural institutions, largely are older white men. And horizontally, more women are represented in those types of work that are sex-typed as female professions. I don't think there are any kind of, I think we could all guess what those might be. Makeup, hairdressing, costume departments on a film set, for example, and or office administration. And men are overrepresented in types of work which have historically, and the histories are very, very important here, sex-typed as masculine. For example, just to take the film example again, things like camera work, lighting, visual effects. I think another really important issue that's been the focus of some of my more recent research is that, and this is kind of like an obvious point, but I think it's a really important one, that the cultural production industries are in many ways, they are about identity making, right? They are the stuff of representation. They are about identity making and representation. And that's important because creative workers are concerned with or about representation, presentation itself, and therefore self-presentation. This is about images, narratives, voices, and images and narratives of and about the world in which we live. But I think another contradiction within this is that, so, on the one hand, cultural workers are focused on representation, and on the other, in many cultural industries, we see the relative or almost total absence of collective worker organisation. So collective worker representation, again, not across the board, but in some industries, we don't see. Things like traditional unions, employment legislation, collective bargaining, and so on. I'll come back to this in a second, but I think in the absence of the latter, arguably there is an even greater requirement for creative workers to construct and maintain their creative identities and to see that very much in individualised terms. And that might often entail conforming to the myths, Europa, Zeus, etc., possibly, the myths and or stereotypes of a particular creative profession. And those myths or stereotypes, I think, can be incredibly powerful. One that I think might be the most obvious and possibly the broadest, just to relate to what we're talking about today, might be the myth of, and again, this is historical, it goes way back, the myth of the individual genius. The artist creative, the writer in his garret, the tortured soul kind of suffering for his art. And in my research on screenwriting as creative labour, I traced this myth right back to the earliest days of the profession, in which the screenwriter, as this was becoming a new kind of work, was increasingly coded in representations, the popular media, in the industry itself, industry advertising, imagery, and on screen, coded as male, and therefore as kind of embodying a certain number of other kinds of traits. Masochism, egotism, one has to be a maverick. There were lots of images of screenwriters as cowboys, like yeehaw, anyway, I won't go further into that. But I think the important thing here is that the myths are incredibly resilient. The myths are powerful and they are potentially very resilient. So, these statistics, I haven't given you a huge number of statistics, but I've given you some kind of broad contours. They are, I kind of don't want to reel off the statistics because they can be really tough, to read. But they are persistent, and the myths and stereotypes of creativity and cultural work, that is one example I just gave you, are also persistent. And I really think we actually should read those statistics, and we should label them for what they are. These industries are often vehicles for sexism, racism, and forms of discrimination that would not be acceptable in other workplaces. And if we care about equality, and if we believe that culture can serve as a force for empathy, equality and freedom, which I'm sure we all do, then I think this is huge cause for concern. And recently, as part of a kind of a funded network, I've been talking about these issues with various decision makers in the UK cultural industries, so policy makers, practitioners, artists, organisers and funders. And they are also incredibly concerned about inequalities and exclusions in the industries. We all are. So then my question is, why is change not happening more quickly? I have a couple of points to make on this. I think one important element, and this is a point that my friend Rosalind Gill has written about, is that these inequalities are often unspeakable, as she terms it, especially for cultural workers themselves. If you are a cultural worker and you have experienced gender-based discrimination on a film set or at a cultural or artistic festival, whatever it might be, it can be very difficult or impossible to speak out about that. To do so is to genuinely threaten your job and your reputation, and because these are, remember, flexible industries, they are about freelance work that is reputation-based. I mean, that is how you need to know the right people to get the next job, to keep going in the industry. This really does matter. And as I said before, cultural workers often, not always, but often, aren't officially protected. If they are not represented by a union, they aren't covered by traditional employment legislation. They don't have recourse to anti-discrimination legislation. Again, it becomes even more unspeakable. So, what's interesting then is that in policy debates or in mainstream media, and this has become quite a hot issue in the UK, I'm not sure about the rest of Europe, but people are sort of generally talking about these issues as a problem and something we need to address. What's interesting though is in speaking about these inequalities, quite a few excuses are often made, and I think Rosa and I have talked about this, they are often quite lazy excuses. So just quickly, I want to give you a couple of those and kind of try to refute them. So one excuse or argument that might be given to say, oh, well, these, the statistics are bad, but, what are we going to do about it? One of those arguments would be about meritocracy or talent. Talent will rise to the top. Hiring practices, which might often be about who you know, and hiring someone that looks like you or sounds like you, or an old boys network, whatever it might be. That's justified as being conducted based on merit rather than on personal relationships or networks. But of course, this totally obscures wider structural inequalities that mean that very many talented people who may have also been educated in these fields never get in, right? We know, we've already talked about the fact that more women than men are studying for higher degrees in a range of relevant disciplines. Certainly on my degrees in cultural and media industries, it's often 95% women year upon year. But we are not seeing these graduates moving into these industries in growing numbers, and we're certainly not seeing them moving into positions of decision-making power. So I think that argument about talent is frankly often quite destructive, and it preserves the status quo. Another argument might be, it's getting better. That's another good one. The argument that things aren't great, but they aren't as bad as they used to be. Again, I would refute that. I mean, the statistics indicate inequalities are actually potentially getting worse, and they certainly get worse at moments of financial and other kinds of economic crisis. Women just left the film and television industries in droves in the UK during the 2007 and 08 financial crisis, and I'm very, very fearful about a post-Brexit crisis and the consequences of this. That's a real pressing issue for us today. Another argument would be that, in relation to motherhood, a key justification for why more women can't sustain careers in the cultural industries is that at some point they go and have children. Now, of course, this might be true. Women have the biological capacity to bear children. Yes, okay, we all know this. But that argument, I think, is used actually to routinely shut down the debate entirely. It is framed firstly as motherhood and not as parenthood, and I think that's quite interesting. Men raise children too, and they do so both in and outside the cultural industries. And actually, more than this, I think that kind of argument obscures much, again, wider structural issues to do with the disassembly of the social safety net in many neoliberal economies. Childcare or other kinds of care, elder care, are becoming increasingly expensive, are not subsidised, and are certainly not provided by employers. Certainly not, I don't think, creative or cultural employers. So if cultural workers have childcare or other caring responsibilities, this is certainly an issue, since this work is often already, as we know, very precarious and unpredictable. So we could disrupt those debates and arguments and call them out. That would be one thing. And I just want to finish with a couple of galvanising calls, as Belle did earlier. In terms of battling the stats, radical change is possible. The Swedish Film Institute reached 50-50 funding distribution between men and women filmmakers in just 2.5 years. It was quick. They didn't use a simple quota system, but something much more comprehensive, which included self-monitoring of their own organisation and what it was doing. I think there are also ways we all here can reclaim the possibilities, those emancipatory possibilities of cultural work, to rewrite the myths and to elevate new myths. That's what I hope we're all going to do here today. I said before, cultural work is often coded as individualistic, as centred on individual creative genius, but we all also know that creativity is a deeply social and collaborative act. That's what the creative is. I don't know if anyone's watched Transparent, the Amazon Prime series, but I've been very interested to read what Jill Soloway, the creator of that show, the way she speaks about her creative work. I think she's entirely reframing and rewriting the language of cultural production in her own way. She describes directing with a female gaze. She describes directing as a collaborative play, as non-hierarchical, as non-gender binary, as seditious, and as, oh my gosh, feminist. She's doing that with Amazon money, but maybe that's what we all need to do now. We need to just get Amazon on our side. And so, just to finish, I also want to say cultural work crosses boundaries, paid and unpaid, home and work, production and reproduction, to name just a few. And these are boundaries that might often be gendered, but they can be, agitated. This can be a productive force. This kind of boundary crossing we can do actively in our cultural work, in our collaborations, and in our research. Kathy Weeks has recently called for a form of utopian anti-work politics in culture and cultural production as a feminist response to excessive neoliberal productivism. Maybe we should all say, no work, just play. Okay, we'd have to talk about how we do that, but anyway. So I think, to finish, enhanced female participation can and must inspire peaceful, democratic, radical change at a broader European level. And we must speak about current inequalities, no more unspeakability. We must speak about their contours, their nature, their power, undo the myths, and create new mythologies. Thank you.
Awesome. I especially like that you had some proposals to make, that actually it's not just complaining, or not complaining, but telling how things are, but saying, hey, let's do this. And I'm absolutely with you in this. So you said that actually statistics are saying that no, it's not getting any better. But do you think that there's still some room for optimism? And are there any changes that you have seen lately that you think might point us into a better direction?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And I think maybe for dramatic effect, I might have slightly overstated that point. I suppose I find that it's getting better argument generally somewhat problematic, but I do think actually there is reason for some optimism. And if we look in particular industries, and maybe the kind of Swedish Film Institute one might be a good example, kind of small deliberate acts can kind of lead to a radical change, something like 50-50 participation, if that is what, if there is a will, there is a way, in kind of a funding organisation or a policy-making body, it's possible, you know, and that can have, as we see with that example, really, really quick, direct kind of change. I think, I suppose why I was making that point quite strongly is that, yeah, it really is at times of, you know, broader economic crisis where you see the kind of, the insecurities or the precarity in the system, you know, kind of disproportionately affecting women and those other groups, ethnic minorities, those from, you know, kind of working class backgrounds, as we would broadly call it in the UK, because these industries can be, you know, not only are they difficult to get into, but they rely so much on forms of tacit knowledge, forms of cultural capital, which can take a long time to kind of, you know, gather, right, around yourself. You know, and often it means doing free work, you know, unpaid work for years and years, you know, before maybe you have a big break and you break in and then, you know, you're desperately trying to keep going. So I think there are signs for optimism, but I just think that it's getting better argument is, it can still be very destructive. It can just, you know, I don't know, things like if someone brings up quotas as a possibility, you know, it's very, very easy for a government department to say, no, things are already getting better, we don't need to bother with more radical change like a quota system, for example. So, you know, I think we just have to be careful. But yes, I think some optimism would be acceptable.
Would you like to ask something or make any comments? Are you okay for the moment? Yeah.
In case of United Kingdom, I am really very worried because we are seeing, as you know, big problems, especially with some ministers of United Kingdom. I'm thinking about Liam Nixon, I guess is his name, the minister of external trade, commerce, Liam Fox. Thank you.
Yes,
I was really very worried when they say, for example, that to negotiate the Brexit, you will use immigrants as a tool to make the change. And I'm really worried about the laws who will be substituted by European laws in United Kingdom. For example, we know that in Europe, we will need something like 80 years to get equality between men and women and about the payments. And how do you see that in the future for the United Kingdom?
I'm trying not to cry. Yeah, Liliana, this is a great question, and one that I don't know if I have any answers to because things are still so uncertain in the UK at the moment. We're in this limbo of there was some kind of a suspended animation where we are told a hard Brexit is coming, this masculine language, the hard Brexit is coming, and you know, so we're told it's coming, be prepared, and yet we don't know when the guillotine's going to fall, shall we say, or what effects this will have. I mean, it's really interesting because if we take something like equal pay, you know, there is, I think, a British system of, you know, legislation around equal pay is about to be brought into kind of, it's coming to fruition in the UK, and that's going to require all companies with over, I think it's something like 25 employees, someone might have the actual number to hand, will be required to, you know, do an audit and present their kind of gender breakdown of their employees, you know, and that will be made public. But I think there is a real concern still about, you know, if a hard Brexit happens, you know, so much of the momentum around equal pay is tied, it seems to me, into the broader European project. So that's a real worry as to, you know, what would happen if it goes ahead and what that long-term effects might be for the UK. I think it's incredibly worrying.
Okay, let's...
Just a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
To add to what you just shared, a lot of what you talked about was sort of the industry, producing culture. Another important aspect is the content it provides, which becomes sort of an amplification of what's already going wrong by the way it presents the world how, you know, it should not be. Should we start interfering on the demand side? Because ultimately we are all consumers of media, right? Or should we try to intervene on the supply side? Or is that too naive of a question, we just need to do both?
I think it would be great if we did both, yes. I really do. And I think probably, you know, there's an extent to which on the supply side, yeah, we can kind of make demands. But actually, I think if we made more demands as consumers of media, I really actually think that would be wonderful. I do. I mean, yeah, I don't know where to start with it, but I think, yeah, there have been broad criticisms made of the BBC, for example, in relation to all of these questions and the content we provide. And as people, you know, who pay for that, you know, we have a direct stake, you know, and I'm sure you all have your examples of this. So I think, yeah, I would just say you're absolutely right. If we, yeah, as consumers, some of us as parents, you know, possibly if we took a more active role from that side, it might be a very exciting pincer movement. Let's hope.